Welcome back. It's been a bit since I did a discussion video of sorts. Regardless, I had this idea brimming in my mind for a good amount of time, but I didn't think to make it, mainly because I was holding off on maybe just finding the right time to talk about it. But I figured the sooner I do it, the better, mainly because as we get more arcane weapons in the game, we're going to have a better idea of how we're going to be getting these distributed and from what games or from who specifically. And it's really got me thinking as to whether or not we can predict what the future arcanes could be, not necessarily the effects, but what the weapon will be and what game they'll come from. And this is by no means definitive. This is more so theory prediction than anything else, but I do think we could use this idea as a baseline for what could potentially be future arcane inheritables. So yeah, I just wanted to go over my thoughts on all of that, and that's pretty much it in terms of just the introduction, so we may as well just get right into it. Currently, we have 3 arcane weapons. We have the sword, which we got on debut with Arcane Lift. We got the breath that we got from Arcane Grima, and soon we're going to be getting the Arcane Axe from Ganglot. Right now, as far as we know when it comes to the precedent, is that the gateway to get to these arcanes is through weaponry that don't have any sort of effects, mainly the silver-esque weapons. So initially on the original Arcane Sword trailer or Fate Channel or whatever the case may be, they showed that the only way to get the Arcane Sword is through Silver Sword. And following that we had the Arcane Breath, and the only way you could get that was through Flame Tongue. And presumably if they keep up the pattern, it's going to be Silver Axe, Silver Lance, so on and so forth. So using this as a precedent, I do think that if we were to base it on weapons that have no effect as the pathway to the inheritable, we could predict what the weapon will be from what series, and potentially maybe even the character equipping it. Now, of course, there's definitely going to be some clauses into the mix. For example, the Silver Sword and the Silver Axe in particular, they're from original characters, and the majority of the cast in the game aren't from the heroes of the lineup. So naturally, if you were going to take the inheritable Silver Swords into account, chances are the inheritable options when it comes to the heroes cast is going to be much more limited than you would get from Awakening, where you have Olivia, Chrom, Lucina, Owain, and the same thing with the Axe. But I do think the heroes catalog does make up a bit of it, because we do have Anna, Gustav, Helbindi, and there are a couple others, but I'll go over that in a second. I do think another clause when it comes to all of this is the accessibility, whether that's demotes or normal pool units or even potentially grails. Right now we don't have the grail precedent, but as it currently stands, I do think it's either going to boil down to really accessible units, whether that's your Asker trio or anything that you could get in the normal pool, whether that's a 4-star special or a demote, or even just a regular 5-star. And as a result, I do think that could play a role in whether or not a specific game gets a specific arcane, and whether or not we can predict the unit that comes with it. However, if we were to take seasonals and grails into account, we may take grails into account, but if we were to take seasonals into account, it would just muddy the waters by quite a bit. And as it currently stands, they haven't used any sort of seasonal or limited time unit in the trailer, so I don't think it's worth counting them. Same with the grails, but that could always change in the future. Out of that, there's always a possibility that we could get already existing weaponry for new arcane, so we could always get another sword, we could get another breath, and that could always override the prediction, but nevertheless, outside of that, there's probably just the representation, and I think that's the one point I'm going to be highlighting the most, because I do think that will give us a better idea of what could potentially be the arcane for the specific game. And by representation, I mean the units that have access to the weapon that will allow them to get the arcane in the first place. So for example, if you wanted to inherit the Arcane Sword to Zephiel, for example, you could always grab a Silver Sword from Olivia, and Olivia would be the representation there because she is one of the few units that can have it right out of the gate, and you can have it ready for the trailer. Given that we already have swords, breaths, and axes, the axe is definitely going to be another outlier because it's based on an OC, but we do know that it's not going to be limited to OCs as they weren't with Ascended, so I wouldn't worry about it as much. Still, when it comes to every other weapon type, we only have the lances, the red tomes, the blue tomes, the green tomes, the bows, and the daggers. I'm not including the staves because I think that's just a whole different issue on its own, because there really isn't a generic stave per se, but also I don't think we'd ever really get an arcane stave, as we may also never get an arcane beast stone, but that could always change in the future. There's no telling. Either way, I really just want to focus on those 6 weapon types. And starting us off, I do want to talk about the lances, where the amount of representation when it comes to Silver Lance candidates is tied between Shadows of Valentia and Three Houses. And Shadows of Valentia in particular has a lot more variety, whereas Three Houses has 3 Dimitris, a Aseteth, and Ingrid. Shadows of Valentia has Claire, Forsyth, Zeke, Fallen Berkut, and Valentian Est. You could potentially take the Grails into account, but they would still tie. But I think for the sake of everything, we're probably not going to take any of these Grails into account because I don't think they really will set any sort of precedent. Especially since with the Breaths, it was tied between Awakening and Arcanea, and it could have easily been Arcanea because we never had an Arcanea banner this year. But they ended up going with Awakening. But assuming they took Grails into account, it also could have been Fates because that would have had a 3-way tie if we were to take Garen into account. But even with that being the case, I'm going to go over my final predictions near the end of the video. But as it currently stands, when it comes to the potential Arcane Lance, I do think Shadows of Valentia and Three Houses probably has the better shot at it, mainly because they have the most candidates with Silver Lance at base. Meanwhile, with Red Tome, it's pretty definitive on what it could potentially be. It is split across the board in terms of just how many people have Bolganen at their respective 4-star or 5-star base. But the only one that has the majority is Binding Blade with Hugh and Lilina. But when it comes to any other game, it's pretty neck and neck at basically a second place 5-way tie, give or take. Basically, there are a lot of options at play, but when it comes to the majority, it's definitely Binding, as there are more candidates for that specifically. Outside of that, you have Blue Tomes, which is a 4-way tie between Thracia, Sacred Stones, Three Houses, and Jugdral. Thracia has Reinhardt and Olwen, Sacred Stones has Lute and Selena, Three Houses has Marion and Happy, and Jugdral has the 2 Ishtars. And I feel like this one is more of a mixed bag, but I do have an idea of what it could potentially be. But nevertheless, it's still a 4-way tie between those 4 games. For Green Tomes, it's almost unanimously Genealogy with 4 candidates to boot. You have Julia, Deirdre, Lewin, and Sed. I think that one's pretty set in stone, but again, there's no telling as to whether or not it can actually be from that game. It could always be any other game, but still, when it comes to the likelihood of it, they have a much better shot at it. Same with the bow category in Three Houses, where you have Bernadetta, Shamir, Regular Claude, and Brave Claude. They still make up the majority when it comes to Silver Bow candidates, but also keep in mind that they're all 5 stars. There isn't any precedent saying it can't be a 5-star, especially since the Breath had Grima in the trailer, who is a 5-star. So for what it's worth, Three Houses could easily have the Bow Arcane. And then when it comes to daggers, it's most likely going to be Fates, mainly because Jacob, Felicia, and Flora make up the majority of candidates when it comes to Silver Dagger inheritable options. But again, similar to the Red Tomes, you have a lot of other options at play, but the majority of them are made up by Fates. And overall, there are a lot of candidates when it comes to each and every one of these Arcanes. And assuming we don't have any overlap with any games, I do have an idea of what it could potentially be for each inheritable Arcane. Assuming that the Arcanes function similarly to the likes of the Ascendants, where the units already have a base form in the game and they aren't debuting as an Ascended, I think we could follow the same pattern here with the Arcanes. So when it comes to Arcane candidates, I think it's a bit easier to boil down. For Lances, it was between Shadows of Valentia and Three Houses, but I ultimately leaned with Shadows of Valentia for 2 reasons mainly. The first one being that Three Houses already makes up the majority of bow candidates, so that could already take up there. But also because we don't really have a lot of Shadows of Valentia candidates left in the game, at least for banner options. I think giving one of them to an Arcane will probably prolong the amount of banners that we could get, which is why I do think if we ever get a Lance Arcane, it might be for Shadows of Valentia. And who specifically that could be? Honestly, I'm thinking either Rudolph or Clive. Both of them are already represented in the game, although Clive is a Grail and Rudolph is a Valentine's alt. There's no telling whatsoever. I don't think it would be Berkut because I don't think Ascended Berkut makes any sense, just given the context of the game and how he functions in there. But you never know with IS. As for Red Tomes, I think I'm pretty confident in saying it might be Binding Blade, as Hugh and Lilina already make up the majority of the red tome options when it comes to Bolganen. And because of the fact that legendaries can also be ascended candidates, you know, Celica being one of them, I do think we could eventually see ascended Lilina. And I wouldn't be surprised if that ended up happening. Of course, it could always be any other game, but that's my best educated guess when it comes to the red tomes. However, when it comes to the blue tomes, I think it's a bit of a harder sell, because when it comes to the blue tomes, you have a four-way tie between Thracia, Genealogy, Sacred Stones, and Three Houses, but as we already established, I do think Three Houses is going to take up the bow Arcane, and given that Genealogy is only made up of Ishtars, I think we could rule that one out, especially since one of them isn't ascended, and that only really leaves Thracia and Sacred Stones. Reinhardt and Olin versus Lute and Selena respectively, and this one was more of a toss-up, but I do think if they had to pick between the two, it might be Sacred Stones. And my best guess is really going to be Arcane La Rochelle, although she could always be an ascended. There is that theory going around that the Arcanes could always just be based on villains, which so far kind of lines up because you have Ganglot, you have Lif, and you have Grima, but there's no telling whether or not they're going to break that pattern. But so I do think if we were going to get a blue tome Arcane, it could potentially be from Sacred Stones. And it may not even be La Rochelle specifically, it could always be Selena again. But I do think when it comes to selling one of the Arcanes, especially when it comes to a more recognizable character, not to say Reinhardt and Nolan aren't recognizable because they had a lot of popularity boost from heroes, but I do think if they had to slap it on anybody, it could potentially be from Sacred Stones. And then the same thing can really be said about Green Tomes, as that's really made up with Genealogy in the form of Julia, Deirdre, Lewin, and Sed. As far as villain candidates really are concerned, I don't think any come to mind, but I'm still going to go with the idea that it could potentially not necessarily be a villain, and rather we end up getting an Arcane Lewin, which I do think is entirely possible. Again, it could also be ascended, but the likelihood of an Arcane when it comes to the Green Tomes, Genealogy currently has the best chance at it, which is why I do think Lewin could potentially end up getting it. As for bows, I'm leaning towards Ashe mostly. Ashe was able to use bows in his game innately, although every character can use every class, but Ashe came with bows innately if I remember correctly. And he does have a summer alt in the game, so it's entirely possible there, but of course it could always be anybody they really want, because at the end of the day, Three Houses, you can pretty much make any character anybody you want. So I don't think it's really that far off if you were to say maybe someone like Felix or even Dorothea or whatever the case may be. And as for the daggers, we kind of already went over the fact that it was probably going to be Fates, but as far as Fates candidates go, I'm leaning more so towards Saizo or Kagero. The latter is definitely a lot more popular, but she already does have a lot of representation, so maybe they don't want to go down that route. Although they could always go down the Saizo route if they wanted to make it more centric around Birthright, because last time it was definitely more centric around Conquest. I could definitely see Saizo being a candidate. And beyond that, there's not really much else to say. I think these are probably going to be my best guesses when it comes to the Arcanes. And obviously this theory isn't perfect. There's more than likely going to be a ton of flaws, whether that's with doing another sword, a breath, or axe, or even if they just want to go with any sort of other unit that doesn't make up the majority. I'm more so basing it off probability. But at the end of the day, there's not really any sort of way to tell, but I do think it's food for thought, and it could be pretty cool for discussion going forward. So yeah, you'll have to let me know what you think down below. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.